Hey friends, welcome to another episode of the 10 Laws Podcast with East Forest. I'm East Forest. Thanks for joining us. This week I have an episode with William Meyer. He's an expert and teacher in meditation and youth, which kind of relates to all of us and our inner youth and how we impart these ideas. So I think you'll enjoy it. I just want to let you know about the East Forest Spores ceremony that's happening on Saturday, the 3rd of October. And it's on YouTube, but you can also watch it at eastforest.org. It's a live event. This is at 8 p.m. Eastern Time on Saturday. And it's just an opportunity to really dive in like we have before with these other live streams. It's a long-form event, improvisationally based, where my goal is to get into a state where hopefully I'm out of the way and something larger can come through that is all of us. And we can experience that together. So please join us. There's a Facebook event if you want to log that you're coming or invite some friends. You can go to that, East Forest Music on Facebook or whatever. But I'd love to have you, and it's always great that we gather at the same time around the world because it's just, I can feel it. You know, it's a meaningful event to do that together. And it's called the Spores ceremony because I'm releasing the Spores album. It's a new album. It starts on the 2nd, the day before, and it starts to culminate until mid-month when the full album comes out. And the Spores album is like a 1-hour version of Music for Mushrooms, a soundtrack for the psychedelic practitioner. And it's kind of the highlights. It's edited down. It's really amazing experience. And we're releasing it on vinyl too. And there's only 300 vinyl. If you'd like to check it out and order one, you can do that right now, and they're shipping now at eastforest.org. Click on the music tab and find the Spores album, and you can pre-order the digital and you can order the vinyl right now. And it's also just announced today that on October 22nd will be my first real world show with Magic Sword in Boise, Idaho. So tickets just went on sale for that. If you're around or in the area and you want to come see an outdoor show where you'll have plenty of social distancing space, they're doing it right. This is how they do it. So it should be exciting. Thanks for giving the podcast a review. You can do it right now while I'm talking. 5 stars makes a big difference. I really appreciate it. You know, I appreciate you guys putting down the quick little reviews there on the iTunes podcast and sharing it on social media. You can send your messages to info@eastforest.org if you want to say hi, you have any questions or whatever, or East Forest on Instagram. All right, let's get into this conversation with William Meyer. Well, thanks for coming on the show. I think a good place to start would be if you could just give us a brief background of like who you are and what this thing is that you're into, and we'll just kind of take it from there.
Sure, yeah, the ultimate question. So I'm my formal title would be a history teacher, a social studies high school teacher. And I've been doing that or playing that role in part for the last 15 years or so. But about 8 years ago, maybe in 2012, early 2012, I had some students got wind of the fact that I meditated, that I had like a pretty solid meditation practice. And I've been practicing meditation probably since I was in high school as well. So since I was about 14 years old. And that's a separate story. But they got wind of that and they asked if I would be a part of this study they were doing on meditation to see if it could improve grades and performance and some other metrics. And I agreed to be part of this study. And
who was doing this study?
Some students. Some students
the
as
students.
part of, yeah.
Oh.
They were, it was a great group of students, the first group. And so I participated in this study, which essentially evolved into a meditation circle. And it was right around sort of that whole end of the world talk in 2012, where the students, they pivoted and they were like, would you guide us in a meditation? Not just sit here in silence, but will you actually lead us in a meditation? And I was like, sure. And honestly, leading teenagers in any meditation is a huge leap of faith. I mean, you don't generally close your eyes when you have 20 teenagers in the room or you're sitting in a circle with them. So I remember doing that December, and it was like this huge shift in terms of the response of the students to that guided meditation. And what grew out of that at first was this meditation group, so meditation club that would meet every Wednesdays, and we've met every Wednesdays since that
Okay.
8 years ago.
Well, I mean, it already doesn't sound like normal, or I would say typical teenage kids. I mean, they were the ones initially who spurred this by wanting to do some kind of self-directed study in the first place. So, would you say is this some kind of specialized school, or are these did you just consider these particularly unique students?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I've actually, this is a public school, and I should have
Uh huh.
probably prefaced that before I told the story. And I've worked in urban schools in Detroit, New York City, and this is a suburban school. But I have found, I mean, there is an interest in whether students would articulate it as meditation. And before, earlier on, that wasn't as common. But there's an interest in this inner engagement that I think is very common amongst adolescents. And if you look at some of the research, and this is part of my own work, you see that there's this window that opens between like 14 and 18. And I see this in my classroom as well. There's a huge difference between a ninth grader and a 12th grader. There's an openness in ninth grade. And by 11th, 12th grade, students are starting to, whether right or wrong, they're starting to form their identities. And you start to see some of that openness close. So, yeah, these students, I think, were exceptional in that they were older and still open. But the work that I do now with kids, and I mean, it goes way beyond just that club at lunch. I'm always amazed at is where they'll go with it. And now I also do these meditations with parents, and I find that the parents have a lot more layers to work through to drop into a meditation in the ways that an adolescent or younger can do.
Well, what relationship do you think the teenagers like interest in this or difficulties or what's spurring it has to do with screen time and like living in a life where there's a ton of that? Like, is it kind of like
Yeah.
they're more hungry for it? They're like, I'm kind of freaking out because I recognize that I'm always on the screen and I'm kind of like, what do I do? Or is it like, I don't know, or is that actually making it way harder for any of this to even work?
I think we've essentially collapsed this like linear timeline that usually is the path people find meditation. So usually it's when people are in their 40s or 50s and they find that all the things they were promised were going to bring them happiness, and then they start to think.
Now that's 15. Yeah.
And now it's like,
16.
yeah, 14, 15. They're seeing this. I mean, they're asked to sit in these classes, don't move, essentially be complacent, very little engagement of their inner lives. And they find that they're more connected, but also more disconnected than ever before. So there is really a desire, I think, to connect with themselves, but also with each other in like an authentic and honest way. And that's what this becomes a window into in so many ways.
Yeah, but I mean, with adults, we're sensing with social media and just the way we're interacting digitally, and especially now more than ever, how all the fragmentation it creates of our attention span and our moods. It seems largely problematic. I mean, I'm not trying to discount the advantages of like even what we're doing right now and all the things we can do with the online space. It's just incredible. But nonetheless, it's like a baby with a tool. We don't fully know what it does. And you look at the work of like Tristan Harris or just the way we're manipulating our brain psychology and dopamine responses and stuff. And I don't feel like we fully grokked what this is doing to our brains, let alone a growing brain.
Oh, absolutely.
And there's a relationship there with like meditation and a hunger. And I'm wondering if it's like a game of whack-a-mole or, it's like we're trying to just counter something or, you know what I mean?
Well, I think that is in some places how it's used, right? You see the way you sell meditation to an audience or parents is you tell them your kids will be more focused. they'll perform better on these assessments. But what the real interesting stuff starts at the other end of that, when what's going to happen when your child is more connected to their own passions, their creativity, their real interests. And I think you're absolutely right. And students get that. Their lives are incredibly fragmented. I mean, prior to all of the COVID piece, most students could tell you exactly what they're going to do from the minute they wake up till they fall asleep. It's like a highly structured day in life in which they live. And that in itself is inherently problematic. And you can see that there's this pushback by students. And what's interesting about the meditation or any form of reflection is you're actually giving them space in the day, which they don't always or tend to have. And I found like the students, there's a lot. I mean, I've done meditations in my traditional classes. I've done them in these circles. I've led meditations for the whole school. And I'm always amazed at who returns. And the thing about students or kids, adolescents, is you've got to give them something tangible. Like adults will be patient with you in that way. They'll show up, they'll behave, but if you don't give a tangible experience to a student, and that's why I think the guided meditations are really powerful. If you don't give them something tangible that they can walk away with, and for me, it's not just about shifting the body and the nervous system. Those are all great, but like when you can help a student connect or explore an obstacle, an issue, or a relationship in that inner space, that's a real shift for them. They might never have looked at things that way or understood things in that way. And that's where I see the students return. Like it's that piece. It sort of breaks through all of the buzz and the electronics and the screen time. But it has to be tangible and concrete.
Yeah. Let me ask you about like the method itself. Like, are you using a particular practice or lineage? Or are you finding that it's important not to have any trappings of, say, Buddhism or anything New Age? I mean, what's the mechanism that's working or not working?
So my introduction into meditation, as I mentioned earlier, was I was actually introduced to a Buddhist monk in Detroit by my uncle, who was a deacon. And he got wind of that I was interested in it. He took me down to Hamtramck, met this Buddhist monk for the first time. And I can still remember sitting across from him and the monk saying something along the lines of like, it's taken you hundreds of lives to sit here. I was, what is going on? Like that's a moment most people don't forget. What I've found in my own is it's sort of it's a hybrid. It's a composite of my own experiences. I mean, I always begin with the breath. I always then drop students into the body. And then I like to end with moving them into a visual, whether that's like walking along a path, whether that's engaging with someone around a fire or some natural element. And it's really evolved literally over these 8 years through the work with them. Like what they've responded to has been my training. And I'm getting a PhD right now in education. And honestly, I have so many degrees that are probably useless and ineffective. But I find the one place I've, for whatever reason, have really gone intuitive is with the meditation. I've never sought any training on how to lead a meditation other than bringing in what's worked for me.
So, I mean, is what's working for you and for them a kind of focusing with breath and putting the intention on one thing as a way of relaxing and then opening up through that process to subtler sensations and intuition? And it's sort of a natural process of what bubbles up?
Exactly. And I think it has to be grounded though. And this is interesting. So I've done meditations in my classes connected to the curriculum, like around research. So as a history teacher, students often do research papers like medieval world, ancient world. And I've used meditations to have students explore questions about their topics that they otherwise could not answer, explore them in a meditation. And it's incredible when we sit around in the circle and share what insights they garner from a guided meditation into the question. But I've learned through that experience, they have to be anchored. So whether it's in the class through a guided meditation around a research question, or it's, let's say, in the club around a relationship or a letting go process, there needs to be an anchor to the meditation, or I find like they can get incredibly lost and overwhelmed in the process.
What do you mean by anchor? What does that look like?
Well, I think you have to be really careful, and any educator has to be aware of this. You go into you're given the responsibility of you're creating a space for young people to explore themselves, and some of that might surface emotions, experiences, or trauma in the process of doing so. So when you go into those spaces, when you move into the body with the breath and you start to move into maybe a particular theme, like letting go of what no longer serves them,
Mm-hmm.
you need to really anchor and be specific in the language used, because there's the potential that you're opening a whole breadth of emotions and experiences that they might not be able to manage at the moment, and you might not be able to manage it. So what I find is going in with the real intentionality is so powerful and so important. I just did a meditation with students 2 days ago. These were seniors who are leading the transition of ninth graders into high school. And the meditation was all about setting an intention. So at the end, the guided meditation was them finding themselves on a beach, imagining the rocks and objects along the beach are things they're ready to let go of, like those heavier thoughts, heavier emotions. But then I asked them to take one of those objects and just carve a word into that beach that would be their intention for the year. And I think these students in particular, there is so much uncertainty in this year that they're heading into. And that's probably a greater reality of every year, but it's very visible now. This idea of a word or a centering idea to come back to is like an anchor for them. And that imagery is an anchor that I would use in the guided meditation, if that makes
Okay.
sense.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, is there any? Do you ever like explore methods of meditation that are not using words? So it's sort of like either just silence or music based, things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I've done some great silent meditations on field trips, which is really powerful in terms of taking students into different spaces. One of the most memorable silent meditations I ever led was on top of the Tor in Glastonbury. I had the chance of leading a group of students there, and we got up there, and it was actually again the students who were like, let's do a meditation. What an incredible space and landscape. And so all I did was the breath, and then I let them go into their bodies and then whatever they discovered. But it's not, silence doesn't mean there isn't structure. And I think that's an important thing to remember. And I mean, you're aware of this. You work in the world of sound and sound beyond words. So silence, it means at the end of that, though, you still have to bring them out of the space. You still need to offer them the time to reflect and share. What I find even more powerful than just whether it's silent or a walking meditation is letting them share what they experience at the end with one another. I mean, that's where it really collectively grows into something beyond any one individual. And that's really, really powerful for students to feel that sense of connection.
Do you think that you know there's a particular age that meditation is more useful, or they're more primed to learn this, or like, is there any value in trying to introduce this or teach it to a 5-year-old or an 8-year-old, or is it sort of like when you're at a certain age, like you're already there in a way?
Yeah, right. And it's like it's the reteaching or the unteaching that goes on. So one of the books, I ended up writing a book for teachers, Three Breaths and Begin, which is more of an explanation of this process and these techniques. But after we wrote that book, or I wrote that book, my agent said, why don't you pitch one of these guided meditations? We'll pitch it as a picture book for kids. So I wrote basically a guided meditation, which became Big Breath, and had this beautiful illustrations for Brittany Jacobs. And that book you can read to like a 2-year-old. It's a picture book, but you're reading them a guided meditation.
Mm-hmm.
And then we actually, next year, we've got Healing Breath come out, which is another guided meditation as a picture book about the planet and connecting to the planet. So I mean, obviously, kids, and I have a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old, and probably my 4-year-old likes the picture of me at the end of the book more than he likes the book. He's a tough critic. But I mean, the kids are there, right? It's like we take them out of there. I always say to seniors or when they're leaving high school, just stay open. Just stay open as long as you can and make every choice and choose every path that feels more open than the other. And that's how you live a good life. And the problem is so much of education is closing, it's labeling, it's narrowing. And the younger we can get, or the earlier we can get to kids around meditation or mindfulness or these practices, like they don't have to undo all of the damage when they're adults. They'll be there. They'll be working, solving, connecting, creating.
Yeah, I was never introduced to this as a kid or a youth, and I had no concept of what it might mean to identify with something other than the train of thoughts in my mind. And nor did I think I had any influence over them. I mean, I really felt like I was the words that was the inner dialogue. And that was really hard because when you can fall into these spaces of depression or anxiety and you're just sort of deeper identified. And there was no tool to work through that. None. No guidance with that. And I also think about growing up in kind of suburban Western society today, and a lot of adults, how this reverberates in our lives too, how we have no rites of passage, typically speaking, and what role that might play in our identification with the sense of self and the creation of the sense of self and moving into what it means to be, quote unquote, an adult. And so sometimes I wonder, how much we're triaging these sorts of problems by trying to introduce meditation. Not that I feel like that's a great thing, bringing stillness in a world that's very fast. But do you see this as a kind of issue? How we're just sort of moving through the malaise of growing up, and then somehow you're supposed to just keep going, but it's all about harm reduction in a way.
Yeah, well, we've commercialized meditation and mindfulness, and you see that within schools as well. It's sort of like retroactively added into the curriculum. But I think you raise a really good point here. It's like, how do you break through that noise and that dialogue within your own minds? You think about it in these students. I mean, we're having 90% of the same thoughts today as we had yesterday, and then we're wondering why our lives are unfolding the same way, and we have the same issues with these relationships, or we're having issues with our own sense of empowerment. But I think going also to the point you're raising about this lack of ritual is we have these rituals of growth, but they're all external. So we graduate students, but we're basing it on their essentially their external or mental or intellectual achievement, not necessarily a measure of their empathy, their compassion, how much they connected to their heart. So it's interesting when you go back and you look at more of these indigenous and ancient rituals that existed around the whole self, and what aspect of those could be brought into these processes or these points in our own lives as we get older. They don't exist because we don't honor them. Like most of the rituals that exist in some ways are a reflection of what we value, which is your impact economically within our society. So how do we shift that and also begin to value these ideas of your ability to connect to yourself or your heart? And I think, and I've heard this brought up in other conversations you've had. To me, the key is service. All right. So like, it's not just about going in. You go in so you can come out. And when you come out, you have a better sense of purpose, place, but you can also offer something. You can address a larger need. And I think that to me is so important. And meditation, mindfulness alone doesn't resolve anything. I mean, you just can't turn people inwards. You have to turn them in to bring them back out. And so connecting it in that way is powerful. And even thinking about what's going on today and how these larger issues of race and equity and inclusion are impacting schools, to me, meditation is a great tool of exploring identity. What do we bring? How do we understand our own identity, and how do we understand that as it relates to others? And I lead a lot of the service components within the school I work at. The problem is we've had these deficit models where students would come in, often white students, into poorer communities of color and reinforce this savior model with these implicit biases that existed within them about what is lacking in that community and how they're going to resolve it. But I think what's interesting is when you offer students and you engage them in reflectively on themselves, how do they view themselves, and then into these spaces, they don't have to necessarily bring all of those pieces into it, and it can be a much more productive and powerful experience for them. So I guess there's a lot there that is touched on, but it's the lack of the inner life to me, or acknowledging inner milestones, that also is really problematic in the long-term growth of anyone.
Yeah, and inner milestones sometimes are hard to intentionally cultivate. I think in past traditions of different cultures, you would see it through times of trial. That was what was intentional. It's like they recognized what you needed that. Otherwise, you're waiting for it to happen at later points in your life, where you go through a near-death experience, or in some ways, we're going through that now collectively. And so that is the waking up that is happening and that we're feeling. That is the unease, perhaps. But you saw this also in shamanic traditions, that it's like pushing people to an edge psychologically, internally. I mean, really extreme edges, guided through that potentially by some kind of shamanic ritual. And we don't have this anymore. And maybe you could argue, I'm just spitballing that, like, kids' adolescent drug use is sort of a grasping for this. It's like trying to find what is, they know inherently there are edges to their mind, but they're actually being told, don't go there, just abstain.
Right.
And then there's all sorts of danger and missteps you can make in that. But it seems to be part of growing up. You want to find those edges of who you are. And so I've found that breathing or some kind of centering or kind of that calming to be able to hear and to listen is the gateway and the doorway to any of these experiences. Times of trial of any kind. Like, how do you work through grief? How do you work through times of deep stress? I don't know any other way, but I wasn't taught that. And so it seems like perhaps meditation and teaching you how to center in a way, how to calm, how to slow, how to listen is a way. Then it's sort of the building blocks of how people and kids can then step into rites of passage or deeper rituals.
And I think you're touching on this idea of how narrow it is, that what we're actually engaging when we're in these classrooms and these schools, and students have this desire to be engaged fully. So they'll seek it out if we're not doing that. And I also think you're touching on this idea that there are these edge states, right? And we're in this place right now, this moment that's incredibly traumatic on a lot of levels in terms of what we're seeing. Not just a public health crisis, but we're also dealing with like a crisis of consciousness, or what's happening in terms of these deeper ideals and understandings that exist within our own society. And students are the ones who want to be engaged in this. I find that often, for better or for worse, and I think if you look at what's happened recently, right, it was a 17-year-old who was involved, or who put it upon himself to engage, or as he saw, engage in this movement or against this movement and what he felt was appropriate. So you're right. If we're not looking, if we're not finding ways to help students recognize these other parts of themselves in a healthy and a productive way, and through their breath work, through reflection, through stillness, and through experiences that challenge who they think of themselves as. And up to this point, I think travel has always been powerful. Connection to nature is equally incredibly powerful. But now we have to find ourselves, we have to sort of think creatively. How do we do this when students are literally sitting in front of computers in the same spaces that they sleep and relax and rest in? How do we challenge that? And that to me is where the inner landscape is like, it offers so much breadth and expansiveness. So thinking about ways in which we engage students, if we don't do it, they'll seek ways to do it themselves.
Yeah, and it's not naturally happening by all the screen use. I mean, that use seems to be actually doing the opposite. It's instilling a kind of surface level identification because you're just distracted. You're not having to really engage at all. You're just receiving information, and then we get into the whole stuff of like what information you're even receiving, and that's another like problematic level. You get back into social media and how it's sending you down these avenues and rabbit holes based on misinformation or beliefs, and it just gets deeper and deeper and deeper, and you're just so passive, and how it's changing, neural pathways, and you're starting to get used to these neural pathways, and I think it's just a really tricky situation that we're in, and I just keep thinking about like the injustices of the people who would need this the most, who have the least, inner city, probably people of color. And the nature would help, but they don't have access to that really. Even the technology, they might not even have all access to that. But it's just like we need a kind of leadership in this country to recognize, it's sort of been said in the background, this is a mental health crisis at its core. But if we looked at it, we flipped it around like that and thought about that. It's like if we worked from the inside out, the kind of solutions we want can only come from a kind of inner shift. And we can't keep just putting different kinds of Band-Aids on the top, like even a vaccine or something is like
Right.
that, or a particular police policy will change. It's like, well, that will help, but we're going in the other direction. And we have to come from the inside, the opposite direction, to kind of first start to see like our shared humanity, or what our individual wounds are and our collective wounds, there's many of them. And I don't know another way to heal trauma but time and tenderness. You kind of have to let an inner process happen, and it seems that meditation is one way. And when we use that word meditation, I think it's important, I would think, to say that it's a broad approach.
Yeah.
Perhaps it is just about, like, it's the kryptonite of being distracted. It's like, it's a polarity to distraction. It's a polarity to disengagement. It's a polarity to being unfocused in a way. I don't know.
And that's how when I'm asked to define meditation or mindfulness, to me, meditation is just this idea of intentional focus. And mindfulness is embodying that in all that you're doing. But I think two things that you said that are desperately lacking within schools today is time or tenderness, right? So, in fact, in many cases, schools or institutions, they're saddled with so much. And to me, this crisis speaks to what we've put on them and we continue to place on them. And now that they're not functional, it becomes very obvious what existed in them. Schools weren't just about educating. They were, in some cases, providing public health. They were providing food. They were serving
Right.
as childcare
Right.
and all these additional pieces. So it's like the schools themselves were overburdened. I find that in my own school, I can see how challenged they are in trying to meet the demands, the larger policy demands, or what are being decided. How do you create these environments where students can learn in a healthy way? But I think this idea, coming back to this idea of time, it's like that doesn't exist. And And yes, it's more poignant in certain communities. We see this within cities. We see this. That I still think there are another set of issues that we see in suburban communities and within white communities and affluent communities around an inability to even recognize, right, their place or the larger role that they're playing in this broader system. And that's where the timepiece, like, until we slow down, until we have space, we offer some type of space within the curriculum where we honor an individual's own self, their own journey, their own gifts that they can bring, and allow them to play some role in deciding maybe what they choose to learn, what they choose to engage in. It's unlikely that we're going to grow these other pieces of compassion and empathy on the inside that are crucial to this broader healing on the outside to
I mean,
take place.
if we had Marianne Williamson or something as president, or even Secretary of Health, or I don't know, Education, I wouldn't be surprised if there's this idea of introducing into education. There was a class on, I mean, call it what you want, but meditation, mental acuity, because look, it's totally mainstream in the business world.
Yeah.
As far as like being a better business person, it's totally mainstream in the sports world as far as like they hire mental coaches.
Right.
So those are two, like, isn't that what we're sort of preparing for in schools, like sports and work and business? So it's like, yeah, so we're going to teach you early on. We're going to try to give you skills to like mental dexterity, mental like fortitude, which, you know, it's a class for like slowing down and learning what it means to like, I just think that'd be amazing.
Well, and you think about it, I mean, you never hear that. And the only time we actually address these issues often is when students are in crisis. Students like in serious crisis, or they're in some way endangering themselves or others, then we begin to address it in a meaningful way. But this idea of collectively shifting or addressing this need to offer students something more than just content, like an ability to, manage their lives, manage. I mean, we say things all the time to students like, oh, you need, find your passion, connect with your passion, and then pursue it. So it's like, how am I supposed to connect with my passion? You gave me the schedule. It has 7 classes. You chose those classes for me. And most of the choices I have on a test are, A, B, C, or D. So I think there's a great deal of fear, honestly, amongst a lot of adults. It's not easy. I go into classes, and the best classes I teach in my own mind are the ones where I'm able to create the space, but also be open to what comes up in that space. That can be very unexpected, whatever they are, questions, comments, the direction the conversation takes. That is not an easy thing to do. Most of us.
That's how you do a good podcast or a good concert or a lot of things.
Yeah, you know it.
Like,
You know
be
it
open
well.
to what's happening and where it wants to go, and listening.
It'd be much easier if you
like,
had just like the song list or the, in front of you. And it's much easier when I have the lesson plan and I can just stick to it. Great question. We'll come back to that another day. But it doesn't work that way.
Yeah. Well, I just keep thinking about how it's all connected to the process we're going through, because on one hand, everything's harder. Like, it's harder to introduce all these ideas. But on the other hand, the crisis and the transition we're going through is cultivating a slowing down. Like, all the problems, in a sense, we're having is is a resistance to what is. Like, we're trying to keep everything afloat, right? And when really what it's forcing, or really the flow that we're being pushed against, is saying, like, stop. Some of these things, I'm not saying that you can, like, stop, just don't go to school, or just stop education, no one go to work, just be at home for a year. It's like, yes, but we need to make money and we need to do this. We need, all of our system is just like kicking and screaming against that. But that is what is happening.
But you hear everything is, with schools, it's all return, reopen. And
part of that's political. Yeah. And part of that is, it's practical. There's 2 kids here, my 2 stepkids that I'm a part-time stepdad of, and like, it's just there's no good answer. It's like, it's not better for them to be here doing school, and it's not good for them to go to school. Right now.
But I think you're touching on something though. It's this idea of we need to go forward. It's not necessarily about returning or trying to recreate something online that existed in person, because we know that wasn't really working. And you can
Mm-hmm.
start to see sort of cracks, on the edges. One is like the College Board. What about all these kids who did take the SAT and the ACT? I bet colleges will find out, oh, it turns out those tests weren't that valuable in determining who should get into these schools or not. So that's a piece where you're starting to see questions. Last year, I usually do this service project in one of my courses. I ended up doing a passion project. I couldn't find service placements at the time because in New York, I mean, we were so hard hit by this that I had students connect to a passion like that they hadn't been connected to for the last 4 or 5 years. And that's something that I will keep. But I also think on a larger level, it's like those smaller pieces offer a shift and rethinking how we're doing this. Even the classes, like if when this is, I don't know if this will ever be gone in the way that we understand it, and I'm not sure that there'll ever be a full return. But there are so many aspects of school that actually can be done better in this format through Zoom or virtually than they could be done in person.
Really?
100%. I mean, I ran in the spring meditations. Our meditation club shifted from an in-person at lunch on Wednesdays to a Monday evening open to the whole community. And we went from 20 to 30 kids showing up to numbers like 50 or 60. And it included, people sent me pictures of their dogs zenned out on the floor next to them.
Well, I mean, is there anything different that you're teaching? Is that specific for these kids? Or is it just sort of like it's the same as it would be to teach it to adults, assuming they're in their teens?
You're talking about the meditation piece or just the underlying ideas?
The meditation piece.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting for kids is you can just tap into these pieces of authenticity, vulnerability, this idea of creativity in a way that they are right there. There's like a hunger for it. Where with adults, and I lead a meditation group with parents, as I mentioned, and a lot of that is more directed, I think, towards healing and more directed towards the challenges that surround parenting in the 21st century. In many ways, that we're not these adults aren't just parenting their kids; they're also coping with the aging population of their own parents. So I find that with adults, there's a heaviness, as I had mentioned before, to what they work through when they go inward. With students, there's the potential for an openness. Like a student will come out of a meditation, and I think in many ways can more easily shed those layers very, very quickly when they're brought into those spaces, and then move into a more expansive understanding of what's possible going forward. Where adults, I find a lot of it is heavier, it's stickier. There's years and years connected to those components. So that's a big shift. That's why bringing this stuff in earlier, it's so powerful. The ripples just go across the surface. Where adults, it's like these heavy stones. There's a lot of waves on the surface as is.
What do you think adults could learn from the way the kids enter, or the way that maybe we could say we maybe would have entered into meditation ourselves when we were younger? Like, what have we lost that we could bring back?
Our vulnerability, right? Our willingness to be
what is that? Like an ability to say yes in a way?
Adults could learn from kids in terms of these more fluid understandings of who they are. I think as adults, we haven't just formed identities, but we hold on to them for dear life. And there's something about a willingness to both explore an identity, but let go of an identity that doesn't work for you, or to recognize that you can be, there can be multiple facets of who you are. That we
kids are doing that all the time these days. I mean, it's like cool to be trans, and then a few months later, like, I'm going to try something else out, and that's cool, and talk about shifting identities in an exploration. It's important to remember, like, the things we believe in are just things we're holding.
Yes.
They're not codified anything. It's just what you choose to hold. And it's, boy, that's some medicine we could use in a polarized country. Just to think that it's like nothing is actually real. It's just things I'm choosing to believe in this moment. And the more you identify with it, the more invested you are in that belief, and the more dangerous it might feel to you because of your own shame and embarrassment to let go of that or change it. Because it's like, but then I made a mistake, perhaps, but then I've changed. And if I've changed, then what was all the worth of that before? It's like, it's not good enough that it led to where you are now. It's sort of like, I don't want anyone to know, that I changed my mind.
That's right. And I see this with students. I mean, yeah, there's like a fear, well, I can't try out for this, or I can't let go of this that I used to do, or maybe try this piece or this stage or take this art class. And it's kind of crazy that you think by 15, you already have made the decision. You don't have time or space in your life to go there. But you see it because, I mean, they see that by us as adults and what we are modeling to them and our lack of ability to take risks. And this idea of taking risks, it's used all the time, but the idea of taking risks in who we are. Like, we're not willing to be vulnerable or share our doubts about maybe even who we are as parents or as their teachers, or the uncertainty and fear that we carry into the spaces that we enter with them. And I think that would be a huge lesson that would shift not just relationships, but the larger ethos of schools.
Yeah, I mean, I was really busy when I was in high school and really concerned with needing to achieve so much in order to like get into a good college, and that whole traditional path was beaten into me early on as a young child. I was very like wide-eyed and creative, and I thought I was like, I want nothing to do with this. And then eventually I saw there was no other option. So it's like, all right, so how do I excel at this system that I did not naturally excel at? I mean, I did really well, but I had to work so hard and be so stressed out. And then I was like, I have to get into a good college because that's the way you do this. And I got into the good college, and I was in this pre-med program. And I remember my freshman year in college going to a career counselor and sitting down with her and being like, look, I'm a little torn because I'm on this pre-med path, which is taking up all my stuff. And then I'm also really interested in like drama and music, and I want to take these other classes. And I expected her to be like, well, you keep working and we'll fit in the pre-med, and this is like, East Coast school. And instead she says, you can always come back to pre-med, take the fun stuff. I was like, seriously? And I never looked back. And like, I just started taking all these music classes and theater classes, and it really opened things up for me. But it really wasn't until, in my late 20s that I think I really started to trust in this ability to do something, to really actually do it then as a living, as a job, as a career. It's just like, I'm not going to work for other people. I'm just going to try and throw spaghetti against the wall creatively and see what happens and make my own way. And thank God I did. And things like psychedelic experiences in my late 20s, like traditional shamanic things, really then pushed me over the edge of exploding my mind and showing me in these felt experiences, like deep, deep meditations, where I was using meditation in that process to say, oh, there is so much more to consciousness and what reality actually is. And that allowed me to have a freedom to come back with more tenderness to this constricted reality. That's just as important, but I'm not throwing any of it away. I'm just saying like, oh, okay, there's just so much more. So it gives you perspective in a way. And I'm hoping like meditation, when you're introduced to it younger, perhaps it can give you that perspective.
Well,
and it can give you a sense to say, the other stuff is not as charged, perhaps.
Yeah. And I mean, what I find interesting about your story is you're working in medicine in some ways. It's just a different form. I mean, you basically are back to the other end of the pre-med piece. I mean, this idea of healing and moving people in these deeper ways. I mean, that's what I think a lot of your music and your work does. And actually, that's a way of thinking about schools and thinking about how can we shift these spaces. But what that individual offered you, I think, was really exceptional. And I think that's probably what more of us should be doing in terms of our own students, our own kids, the young people who are in our lives. Like, do the things that are fun. Do
Follow
the
your
things.
bliss. Yeah. I mean, I pray that we're in a space where everyone has that
Yeah,
choice. I mean, that's really what we need. And engendering like the ability for people to explore what creativity is. Like we throw away the arts and the music sometimes, and I just realize now more than ever it's not just about like making you a rounded human being. I feel like it's making you a human being. What makes you
right.
human is your ability to create, not regurgitate. And even music stuff, I think now I would approach it differently if I was ever in charge of a school. It wouldn't just be about like, let's learn sheet music. It's like, that's fun and that's useful. Or learn the piano, learn an instrument. It's like, but you need to then, what about if you create? How do we jam?
Right.
How do we make a mess with sound? How do we like explore you creating sound, you creating art? You know, and they do that a bit with writing, right? You know, we do a lot of writing and that's important, but that's a form of it. But we need more of that sense of creation from the inside out.
Well, and it's that idea of voice. I mean, even the writing can be very constricted, but this idea of like, how do we support students in developing their own authentic voice? And do we give them spaces to share that voice or express that? I mean, it's if we bring them in, we've got to bring them out and allow them to have spaces to come out and engage and connect with one another in those ways. And I think like, I always joke, if I had my own school, one of the things is kids don't read either. Like they don't. Once we killed reading, which
I
happened,
don't read as much as I used
it happens around
to
like
since the
seventh or eighth
iPhone came into
grade,
my life. You know, I mean,
and
I
it's
used to read
like
a lot more.
that idea. Like they've lost the love of reading. I mean, what does that say about anything? But
I don't
it's
know.
it's the space. It's the space and the time, and just this idea of like we need to offer them these windows inward. And it could be meditation, that's great, but it doesn't have to be. There's so many avenues to go into that inner world. But we also need to give them the avenues to come out and then engage the world from what they've discovered and who that means that they are. And like that, those are key pieces, not just
Yeah,
the
that
in.
service
Yeah.
element you mentioned is really important, and I think it's just a way of you want to Aubrey Marcus's program is like fit for service. Like how do you be fit to be of service? And it has something to do with just sort of being grounded and doing your own work. But I was just curious to ask you as we round the corner here, are you hopeful about the state of education? COVIDian times or no COVID times? Do you feel like it's
Yeah.
evolving, or do you feel like it's sort of a gyrating and an Oribus eating its own tail?
Yeah, well, I think there was like a Buckminster Fuller quote I came across, which was basically like, you don't challenge the system, you create a new one. And I
Right.
think you're seeing that with schools right now. I mean, I think a lot of things are coming to a head and are surfacing. And when I think about education, it's so clear to me like the system just cannot support the current demands. I mean, these schools, our school was supposed to be open next week, hybrid. We're not.
Is it in New York
New
City,
York
or
City
where are you?
schools. We're
You-
just in Westchester, north of New York City, but New York City itself has delayed the start of school till September 21st. It's 1.2 billion students. I mean, the reality of trying, you could write a plan, but actually implementing that plan is very challenging. So to me, it's becoming very clear, like what is currently existing and functioning isn't functioning. And I'm hopeful that on the other side of this, um, we'll find new ways of engaging and being and learning and teaching, and new ways of being with our families, new ways of understanding like the spaces we work, the spaces we reflect in. But it's all connected. I mean, and my feeling is this is going to be a very difficult year for schools, far more difficult than the
yeah,
spring was. A lot
yeah,
more disrupted, a lot more challenging, and that I think actually is a good thing, because I think some of this needs to be challenged.
everything needs a reformation right now, our civilization. And as you said earlier, it will take a form of openness, of us being open to what it is that is wanting to emerge. And that will also take patience and time and listening, fortitude, belief, and some pain. It's going to hurt to
Yeah.
shed the skin, but it's happening whether we like it or not. It's just how much we're willing to really pay attention to the opportunities in front of us.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Would you be open to closing this with leading some form of guided meditation?
Yeah, absolutely.
To
Absolutely.
maybe the theme could be speaking to the inner teenager. I don't know how many teenagers are in my audience, but I'm sure it's mostly adults.
Yeah, I'm totally game. All right, so I will lead this as if I'm leading it to the inner and the outer teenager. So what I always say to students is, find a comfortable spot. Hopefully, it's not on your bed, but maybe on the floor or on a cushion or even a chair. And before we do anything, I always ask them to maybe just roll your shoulders back, maybe even stretch your hands out and crinkle your fingers from all that texting and typing. And then we'll just take a couple deep breaths. And when you're ready, you can start to close your eyes. And as we take a few breaths here, just let those first few breaths be really big, maybe exaggerated, feeling your shoulders rising. As you breathe in, feeling your hands and your arms relax as you breathe out. But just starting to find the breath as it comes into your body, opening up your heart, expanding your lungs, and then feel the breath as it goes out of your body. Just trying to let go of the full breath. And as you begin to find that breath, your thoughts might wander. You might find yourself in different stories or patterns, but just kind of come back to my words, come back to your breath, and even the sensations you might have in your own body at this moment. And when you take this next breath, just let it be natural. Almost imagine yourself watching the breath just come up on the shore like a wave, watching the breath return to the ocean, just being that observer as the breath comes in and the breath goes out. And going with that image as you take this next deep, full breath, just almost imagine the breath moving through your whole body, relaxing your shoulders, relaxing your arms, maybe even feeling your legs and your feet sinking into the ground, picturing them even sinking into the sand. And if we go with that image of the ocean and the beach, just take a deep, full breath and just imagine yourself maybe back at a beach you were at when you were younger, a place you felt comfortable, a place you felt safe. And you can see yourself just walking along that beach for a moment, exploring the rocks, the shells, whatever might be along that edge. And as you take this next breath, I just want you to look around and notice, maybe off in the distance, one other person walking along this beach towards you. This looks like a person you know well, but maybe someone you haven't seen in a long, long time. And as you take this breath in, imagine that person getting even closer and you begin to recognize them. Begin to see yourself, literally seeing a younger version of yourself, maybe a younger version who is a teenager, maybe even younger than that. But whoever came to greet you, just be open to it in this moment. And as they come closer, you might notice that they're just carrying something in their hands. Maybe it's an object. Maybe it's a piece of paper. I want you to reach down as you take this next breath and just look what they've brought you. Maybe you open up that paper and a word's written on it. Maybe you hold that object and an old memory comes to mind. Just opening yourself up to whatever message this younger version of yourself has brought you now. And take a deep breath in and just feel that move through your whole body, not just your hands and your fingers, but your arms and your legs. And you can thank them for what they've brought. You can thank them for what they've given you, even now, knowing and unknowing. And then take another breath and just let them go. And before you open your arms, just look back out over the water, maybe holding that object or that paper, whatever it is. And just take a deep breath in, thinking about all the versions of yourself that are there to help you, to assist you in this moment, in this time, for whatever challenges might arise. And then when you're ready, maybe take one more deep breath, wiggling your toes and your fingers, and you can gently open your eyes.
Thank you.
So I hope you're going to throw down some music with that and just take it to the next level. Ram Dass style.
Yeah, of course.
I love that meditation you gave with the rain outside of Ram Dass's place. I really, really enjoyed that. I think it was like the letting go one. It was like
yeah, a lot of beautiful sounds on the island of Maui that I got to record there. Well, thank you so much for taking the time, for taking us on that little meditation. How can folks dig more into you and your work?
Yeah, that's great. So I have a website, billpmeyer, Meyer.com. But as I mentioned before, I've got a few books out there, Three Breaths and Begin. That's a book for adults and teachers around leading meditations or bringing meditations into schools. That's from New World Library. And also Big Breath, which is a picture book for kids, which is also from New World. And then coming out next year, we're going to have Healing Breath, which is a guided meditation for the planet connected to kids. So, lots of cool stuff out there.
Dig it. Well, thank you so much. Thanks so much, and I hope folks can dig into your world and appreciate you coming on board.
Yeah, thank you. This is great to connect. I'm like a big fan, and I love the podcast, but I love the music as well, and bring it into my own classes. I've shown your TED Talk a couple times in my classes. Students really connect with it.
Cool. That's great to hear. Well, thanks. Thanks so much, William, for joining us. Hope you guys enjoyed the show. This song you're hearing in the background is the home instrumental version from the new release, Ram Dass Instrumentals. That's everywhere that you listen to music. It's a digital release. I always like this one. I love the music to it, especially just because it just feels really inventive with stand-up bass. It's Owen Hoffman-Smith playing that, and like G. Tanzer's doing a lot of percussion stuff there, sort of Cuban-style stuff with this glass mason jar and bongos and congos. And it's cool. It's got a lot of fun stuff. Thatcher Schmidt's doing some of those violin lines. So this is from that album. And yeah, man, you guys keep walking your walk. There is tonight, big debate, first presidential debate. Tune in if that's your thing. But we can do this, folks, one step at a time. Keep your chin up, keep walking your walk. Don't take any shit. If you do it with grace. Hope to see you guys Saturday, live stream.